Welcome, everyone. I'm Barbara Snellgrove, National Director of Education and Support Services with Parkinson's Society Canada. We have over 300 participants joining our webinar on cognitive impairment and Parkinson's disease. Before I introduce our speaker, I have a few housekeeping points. For technical support, we have a toll-free number, 888-777-7965. There is an opportunity for questions, and I'd ask that your questions be of a general nature and not soliciting medical advice. Questions are welcome in French or English. You can submit a question from your computer screen on the Ask a Question icon at the bottom of your computer. The webinar is made possible through a Canadian Institutes of Health Research Knowledge Translation grant. Our speaker today is Dr. Uri Manji, Associate Professor at the University of Montreal. Among his many accomplishments, Dr. Manji directs the Parkinson Cognition, Action, and Neuroimaging Laboratory. He is Scientific Director of the Functional Neuroimaging Unit, and he is a past recipient of a Parkinson's Society Canada New Investigator Award. One of the major goals of his research is the early prediction of cognitive impairment in Parkinson's, and we are delighted that he will be sharing his knowledge with us today. Dr. Manji.
Thank you. Well, first of all, I would like to thank Ivy Lynn Carter and Barbara Snellgrove and the Parkinson's Society of Canada, of course, for inviting me to give this first webinar. So as I understand it, this is a first for the Society and for myself also. I've never given such a webinar. So before we start, I would like to mention that this presentation is provided for information purposes only and does not represent medical advice. So as I think Barbara already mentioned, if you have specific medical questions, you should speak with a healthcare professional knowledgeable about Parkinson's disease. So we'll move to the talk itself. So Parkinson's disease is thought to have been first described by somebody named James Parkinson in an essay in 1817, which was an essay on what he called shaking palsy. The disease then took his name. So the disease is mostly known for its motor symptoms, and the cardinal one, as most of you know, are tremor, rigidity, and bradykinesia, which is a slowness to initiate movement. Have a little anecdote for you today, is that the picture you see on the left is that of a James Parkinson, but it was recently found that it is not the James Parkinson that wrote the essay, and that it may be his cousin, which bear the same name and may have been a dentist. So as I mentioned, the disease is mostly known for its motor symptoms. However, we now know that it is not the whole story. There are non-motor symptoms as well. Indeed, since the end of the 19th century, Benjamin Beld already had reported seeing hallucinations and dementia in some patients. However, the disease has been thought as nearly exclusively a movement disorder, and the occurrence of cognitive deficit was overlooked for the next 100 years or so. It's not until the 1970s and the wider the use of dopaminergic medication and the fact that it was associated with significant improvement of motor symptoms that it was realized again that non-motor deficits can also occur in the disease, and in some cases significantly interfere with the daily life of patients. So here's what I will present today. I will first talk about the different types of cognitive deficits and the cognitive profiles that can be found in Parkinson's disease. I will talk also a bit about the neural origins of cognitive deficits, meaning are there specific things going on in the brain of patients that are linked to these cognitive deficits. We will also discuss a little bit how the cognitive profile of patients can evolve and how they possibly can lead to dementia. We will also discuss a little bit the interaction between cognitive deficits and depression. And we'll talk a bit about the effect of dopaminergic medication on cognition and also a little bit on behavior. And I will finish by mentioning some future avenues in research and a couple of practical suggestions. So, as I mentioned, it wasn't until late in the 20th century that the importance of cognitive and behavioral deficits in Parkinson's disease were really studied properly. And the first important studies came around in the 1980s, and I thought it would be important to mention the Toronto group since we're in Canada. So one important paper was by Taylor and Saint-Cyr in 1986. At the same time, there were also a group in Paris, a group in the United States, and a group in the United Kingdom coming up with important studies on the cognitive deficits in Parkinson's disease. Since then, many others have been published, and I should say that the field of non-motor deficits have exploded in the last 10 years, and there are even conferences which are aimed only at that. So, what do these studies tell us? They suggest that most patients with Parkinson's disease exhibit cognitive changes. However, they are not necessarily severe, and in some cases can even be absent. So, what are the cognitive deficits that have been observed in patients? So one of them includes executive deficits. These are the so-called higher order processes that are needed when planning, solving a problem, or initiating a new task. So in daily life, this may be translated in finding it harder to make a decision or plan what you're going to do today or during the week. However, it should be noted that for most patients, it's not that these tasks are impossible. They're just a bit harder. And often, if you're someone living with patients who have these problems, it helps to give some clues and to help the person initiate the task. And then it will be much easier for the patient to execute those tasks. So also what have been reported are problems in attention. So these are problems in focusing or dividing attention in complex situations. So in real life, it may be hard for patients to resist to distraction that we always have. So you try to focus on a task, but some people are speaking or some visual stimuli is coming to you. Or, on the other hand, it'd be hard to perform more than one task at once. However, I would say that there's been some recent studies showing that even in healthy individuals, it may not always be a good idea to perform more than one task at once. And while multitasking may be asked to us in some professional situation, it's not always the best scenario. So actually, it's probably a good rule it's a good idea if you feel you have some attention difficulties to try and focus on one goal or one concept at a time as much as possible. So there's also been some visuospatial problems reported. So this can be problems in estimating distances, so how far something or someone is to you. Discriminating between visual stimuli, meaning if two things look alike, telling them apart. And also acting on visual information. So these problems are important to recognize because if you have them, it can sometimes increase the risk of falls independently of your motor problems. So those visual problems in real life may translate in difficulties in trying to orient in orientation in an environment with visual complex stimuli, such as finding a specific item or an aisle in a supermarket, which frankly to most of us often look the same. Now, also it should be noted that at the later stages of the disease, illusions or little hallucination are also observed in some patients. Some little language dysfunctions have also been reported. These include word finding and naming deficits. They could actually be linked to some of the memory deficits that have been reported in Parkinson's disease. So in Parkinson's disease, it's not all aspects of memory, at least for most patients, that are affected. It's mostly retrieving information that has already been learned. So as I mentioned, in Parkinson's disease, the problem is mostly with recalling, and not necessarily with pure semantic. Semantic means being able to recognize what an object is, or what a word means, or encoding. There's not a majority of patients have problem with encoding either. Encoding refers to the fact that you're basically learning a new item. So these latter problems can occur more often in Alzheimer's disease. However, in Parkinson's patients with dementia, the memory deficits can be more severe. As a general rule, if you have problems with recall and with organizing your day, using a notepad where you can make a list of the things you might have to remember during your day or your week can be a useful, practical, and simple tool. Most importantly, I would like to stress that not all these symptoms are present in patients. And we realize now that there are enormous differences between every single patient. So I will now switch to discuss a little bit what we know about the neural origins of these cognitive deficits. I should first mention that the origin of cognitive deficits are not completely understood, and that's why, for instance, I'm carrying on the research I'm doing. Some cognitive deficits, such as executive deficits, are thought to be more common and possibly to originate from Parkinson's pathology in the brain, i.e. the most traditional model of pathology of Parkinson's disease is a loss of dopamine neuron, which affect frontostriatal regions in the brain, which I will talk about soon. And a concept has been proposed linked to cognitive deficits that may be specific to Parkinson's patients, which is the concept of bradyphrenia, which describes some cognitive deficits it refers to a slowness in thinking and responding that could share some similarity with bradykinesia, which is a slowness in initiating movement. On the other hand, some other cognitive deficits, some memory problems or even others, are not necessarily found in the majority of patients, and most importantly, might occur from concurrent pathologies associated with aging. So this is a complex diagram which is not important to completely understand. It's just to remind you a little bit about what we know about the pathophysiology of Parkinson's disease. So as I mentioned, it's thought to arise from the loss of dopamine coming from the substantia nigra compacta, which you can see on the bottom square of the rightmost circuit. And the rightmost circuit is linked to the motor deficits that we observe. The second rightmost circuit is also linked to similar systems and indeed seem to be linked to the cognitive processes, while the two on the left are linked to another dopamine circuit which is not thought to be very affected in Parkinson's disease, at least for the first two stages. So the disease seems to evolve from the rightmost circuit to the left, and for reasons, and for the sake of what I will be talking on later on in the presentation, it should be noted that dopaminergic medication are given and the dosage are given to optimize the rightmost circuit, which is linked to motor deficits. So since the 1990s, we have access to modern imaging techniques of the brain, such as functional magnetic resonance imaging and positron emission tomography, that are helping us understand better the origin of cognitive deficits. So I will give you a few examples of what we're doing, at least in my laboratory, with functional MRI to try and understand these better. So I'm sure many of you have seen one of these or been in one of these, even on TV. They're now shown all the time. This is a magnetic resonance scanner with a participant or a patient going into it. It's actually the one we have in our institute. So I'm now going to show you a video of the brain, its anatomy that has been acquired with such a machine. So we're going to start the video. And the video is going to take us from bottom to the top of the brain. Now what you're seeing is the neck of a person, as well as you can distinguish the teeth, the mouth, and soon the nose. And we're soon going to come in the brain proper. So we're starting to now see the cerebellum. And on top of the cerebellum, we're now seeing the structures which are associated with Parkinson's disease, i.e. the substantia nigra. And we're now seeing different parts of the striatum which receive the input from the substantia nigra and which function is affected in Parkinson's disease. And we're seeing various parts of the cortex, such as the frontal cortex and the motor cortex, whose activity is also changed because of these problems in substantia nigra and striatum. So, in our laboratory, we tried to understand a bit better the origin of the executive deficits in Parkinson's disease. And we studied a task which, if there are neuropsychologists amongst you, you will know very well. It's a task that assesses the capacity of a patient or a person to change strategy when a situation is evolving or changing in the environment. So the idea is that the card you see at the bottom will change on every trial. The 4 cards you see on top will remain all the time. The idea is to classify the bottom card to one of the 4 top cards, but you're according to one of 3 rules, which can be color, shape, or number. But you're not told what is the rule or how to classify. You're just told whether you're correct or not. So basically, you're eventually going to find the rule and say, classify according to color, which in this case is red. But the experimenter or the clinician will change the rule without the patient knowing so. And then you have to find this new rule. So say instead of doing color, I'm going to do numbers. And use it from now on. So we can distinguish 2 stages in this process. One is actually finding the new rule. When you're told that you're wrong, you said, okay, I've been using color. What else could I be using now? Oh, maybe shape. So you decide to use shape. This is what we have called planning the set shift. And then there's executing the set shift. You're shown a new card, and for the first time, you're using number instead of color in this example. So we first conducted the study in young, healthy adults to find out what would be the circuits that are usually associated with those processes. And in young, healthy adults, we found that when you plan the set shift, there was a cognitive circuit that includes parts of the frontal cortex, the caudate nucleus, and the thalamus. So a cognitive corticostriatal loop that seems to be specifically involved in planning the set shift. Then, when you execute the set shift, so you're applying it for the first time, we found a more motor circuits that involve the premotor cortex and the putamen, which are the regions that are firstly affected in Parkinson's disease. So then, indeed, we used the same protocol and did the same studies in Parkinson's patients of their medication, that is, asking them to refrain from taking dopaminergic medication from 12 to 18 hours. And we found that, indeed, compared to controls, which were now matched for their age, there was reduced activity in Parkinson's patients in this cognitive circuit that is involved in planning the set shift. And that could have been expected. There was also reduced activity in the more motor circuit, corticostriatal circuit, associated with shift execution. So now we're going to mention a little bit about how this cognitive deficit may evolve. First of all, I'd like to mention that dementia does not occur at the early stages of Parkinson's disease, and usually only occurs after many years following diagnosis. If dementia occurs very soon after motor deficits, it is likely to be another entity, which is called Lewy body dementia. Regarding dementia in Parkinson's disease, while age is the biggest predictor of dementia in Parkinson's disease, like in the general population, age alone does not account for the higher prevalence of Parkinson's disease than in the general population, and indeed it is estimated to affect approximately 30% of Parkinson's patients. So, at the early stage of the disease, we can distinguish between two types of patients. Maybe those with very little or no cognitive impairments at all, and those with so-called mild cognitive impairments. It's a concept that has been in the past used to possibly identify people who are more likely to develop Alzheimer's disease, but it has been found recently that it could be also a useful a useful concept in Parkinson's disease. So, patients with mild cognitive impairment have cognitive deficits in one or more of the domains of cognition that I've mentioned before. But what's important to note, they do not significantly impair their daily life. Indeed, sometimes patients won't even realize they have a problem, and even their spouse won't, because they're fairly mild and does not necessarily affect so much their life. So, we still don't know exactly what are the factors that will predict who is likely to decline badly and who is likely to be fairly stable with respect to cognitive profile. What we can mention, and this is still a very general rule, it may be dependent amongst different patients, but as a general rule, deficits is only one domain of cognition, such as executive function, having more problems in making a decision or planning. If it's only that, if it's only one domain, it is not particularly predictive of dementia. While having deficits in multiple domains may require more attention. So, in order to find out whether this concept of mild cognitive impairment was actually reflected something in the brain, or is only something observed by caregivers and neuropsychologists, we compared two groups of patients with early Parkinson's patients at the stage 1 and 2 of the disease, one of which had so-called mild cognitive impairment, and the other group was cognitively intact. And what we found is that indeed there's a difference in the patterns of activity, with those having no cognitive impairment having a pattern of activity in the cognitive circuit very similar to that of healthy individuals, while those with cognitive impairment, with mild cognitive impairment, have reduced activity and were probably motivated the results we observed previously when both groups were looked at together. What's interesting also is that there's also some differences in motor regions with those people with no cognitive impairments showing higher activity in the premotor cortex, not in the putamen, as this is affected in everybody with Parkinson's patients. And this is particularly interesting because both groups had as much motor symptoms. One was not more advanced than the other. They rated, for the clinicians amongst you, they rated equally on the UPDRS scores of the motor part of the UPDRS. The only difference between the two groups, they had the same stage of the disease, time since disease was similar, it's just that the MCI group was slightly older. Now, depression in Parkinson's disease. It is thought that depression is more common in Parkinson's disease than in the general population. It's actually thought to be more than twice the rate. However, in most patients with depression in Parkinson's disease, it is usually mild to moderate. Furthermore, it is not clear that Parkinson's disease is correlated with all aspects of depression. When you take a depression questionnaire, you probably realize that it includes many things. Loss of interest, indecision, sadness, pessimism, feeling guilty, having sleep problems, all the way to things like feeling suicidal and melancholic. And it doesn't seem that Parkinson's disease per se correlates with all of this, but only with some aspects of these. And actually, it doesn't seem to correlate with the worst aspects of depression. Because in contrast to major depressive disorder observed outside Parkinson's disease, suicidal tendencies or expression of guilt and self-blame are rarely observed in Parkinson's patients. Furthermore, depression is sometimes a bit hard to diagnose in Parkinson's disease, as it can be either overdiagnosed or underdiagnosed because it can be confused with related syndromes but are not depression per se. And these include apathy and fatigue, which are very common in Parkinson's disease, but are distinct from depression. So apathy is a lack of motivation for goal-directed behavior. So it results in a loss of initiative, in interest, in assigning finding something you want to do important, which is called affect for goal-directed events. And also, another thing which is a bit confusing is that similarly to the general population, cognitive deficits, especially those related to attention and executive deficits, correlate with depression. And it is not clear exactly what is their relationship. So it is hard for so one of the things we're trying to disentangle, which is hard, is whether it's the depression causing the cognitive deficits, and what's the exact relationship between Parkinson's disease per se, the cognitive disease, and depression. Do they all come from the pathology of Parkinson's disease, or is there a mixture of things going on? So I'd like to talk a bit about the effect of dopaminergic medication. The effect of dopaminergic medication on cognitive deficits are still controversial, unlike for motor symptoms, where we know that at least for many years, it significantly improves the motor symptoms. Some studies have found some improvement. Others found some worsening. And many found no effects. One should mention that none of the effects are very strong, but they're still puzzling. So, in our laboratory, we wanted to attempt to understand why this is the case. So, as a first step, we reused again our card sorting protocol to compare patients while they were asked to refrain from taking dopaminergic medication for more than 12 hours. And this is under the column that is indicated Parkinson's patients off, which we compared to those who were taking their usual dose of L-DOPA, which is indicated under the column on. And what we found in A is that L-DOPA had no effect in increasing the cognitive circuit, in improving the cognitive circuit. On the other hand, B and C indicate that L-DOPA, so when patients are on medication, it partially, it helps restore activity in the premotor cortex, which is linked to movement. So this may be why L-DOPA is so much more effective for the motor deficits than it is for the cognitive deficits. However, we were still a bit puzzled about the differences within cognition, where it seems to sometimes improve and sometimes worsen. So with a previous fellow of mine, Dr. Penny MacDonald, who's now a professor at the University of Western Ontario, we thought that this may be linked to the type of cognitive processes, and more specifically, whether they would be linked to the dorsal striatum, i.e. the two circuits on the right, that in the image you're seeing right now, or more the ventral striatum, which corresponds to the two circuits on the left. The argument behind this is that dopaminergic medication, as I mentioned before, is optimized for the dorsal striatum, which is mostly affected. But the ventral striatum is not that affected and still receives dopamine from the medication, so it's maybe not optimized for the ventral striatum on the left. So we tried to devise a task that could separate these two regions of the brain which are very close to each other. And the idea was that when a relationship was reinforced, like in the congruent second line condition that you're seeing now in front of you, where the 2 in both the first square and the second square is the smaller number. So the fact that it is the smaller number is reinforced, and if you look after, in prime 2, probe 2 of the second line of the congruent condition, you will see that 7 is the first time and the second time the larger number. So we thought that this, when a reinforcement of an association occurs, this would be linked to the ventral striatum. On the other hand, when an association changes, a bit like in our set shifting, where if you look now at the incongruent condition, the third line, the 2 in the first box is the smaller number, whereas it became the bigger number in the second box. And 7 was the bigger one in the first box and the smaller one in the second box of the third line. And this would be similar to our set shifting, and this would be linked to more dorsal striatum. So in order to find out if this was the case, we scanned people, young healthy adults, with this task, and indeed we found that in the case where the association was reinforced on your left, we found the ventral striatum, and on your right, where the association changed, we found the dorsal striatum, and as you can see, these two regions are pretty close to each other. What was most interesting is that we also, without imaging, we tested patients at the early stage of the disease on and off medication on these two tasks or conditions, and what we found is that the patients improved in the condition where there was a shift following when they took the medication, while they got slightly worse in the condition where there was a reinforcement and that is linked to ventral striatum. So basically, the effect of L-DOPA depends on the specific cognitive task you have to do. So now I'm going to talk about some other studies in the literature that have looked more at the effect. We've been talking about cognition. They've looked a bit more at the effect of behavior that can include depression or things like addictive behavior. So L-DOPA, such as Sinemet, seems to correlate with depression in Parkinson's disease, but it is less the case or not the case for dopaminergic agonists, such as Mirapex. On the other hand, it is possible to observe impulse control disorders such as compulsive buying, gambling, sexual disinhibition after prolonged use of dopamine agonists, but it's not the case with L-DOPA. So I should really mention, and it's really important to note, that these findings do not indicate that L-DOPA induces depression, nor that dopamine agonists create impulse control disorders. What they do is that they tend to suggest that in patients with a tendency for depression or for impulsivity, the use of L-DOPA in the case of depression, or the use of dopamine, I should mention the prolonged use of L-DOPA, and the prolonged use, or in the case of depression, or the prolonged use of agonists in the case of impulsivity, will increase this trend. So why this is important to note, and why are these studies important? The reason that these studies are important is that medical doctors and neurologists not only have to take into account the evolution of the cardinal motor symptoms, i.e. rigidity, tremor, and bradykinesia, as well as the possible occurrence of dyskinesias, which are the kind of cramp that you may experience after prolonged use of dopaminergic medication, when determining the relative dosage of L-DOPA and agonists, but they also have to take into account the patient's cognitive and behavioral profile. And this is why patients with similar motor features and advancements in the disease may have different treatment. So you may, as a patient, you may know a friend that has roughly the same problems as you do, as far as motor conditions are concerned, roughly the same amount of rigidity, tremor, started the disease roughly at the same time, and you're wondering how come he may be taking more agonist and less L-DOPA, and I'm doing the contrary. This is because your clinician is taking into account a complete profile and not just the symptoms. So studies are currently being conducted in our laboratory and different laboratories around the world to understand better the complex relationship between cognition, behavior, and dopaminergic medications in PD. So, where are the future avenues that Sam Labs are doing? And there are many of them, but I'll tell you most about what I know. So, where different groups, and our own in particular, are looking longitudinally for combinations of markers, including anatomical and functional brain imaging, neuropsychological testing, and genotypes, that will help predict the possible occurrence of dementia in specific patients before it occurs. So that by having some combination of patterns, we can develop a profile and know in advance which are the patients which are likely to evolve less well than others. And this is important because if we can identify these early on, then we can explore different therapeutic avenues early to slow down the cognitive decline. And amongst the avenues being explored, there's some medical one. Some of you may have heard of rivaxamine, which is an inhibitor, cholinesterase inhibitor, which can be used in the case of mild cognitive impairment and especially dementia. But there's also non-medical avenues which are explored. These include non-invasive stimulation. What I mean by non-invasive stimulation is stimulation which, unlike deep brain stimulation, which requires surgery, are applied to the surface of the brain and send either magnetic stimulation or electrical stimulation to compensate a bit for the difference in the circuits that we observe. And even less invasively, but as we're realizing more and more importantly, programs of cognitive and physical stimulation, we're realizing that in aging in general, but also in neurodegenerative disorders, including Parkinson's disease, specific programs of cognitive training and physical training help. And what's most important is that we're realizing more than before that there's lots of interaction between them, meaning that sometimes by doing some little physical exercise, you can improve your cognitive function, and even vice versa. So most importantly, even before we know exactly, we devise exact programs, as much as possible, my advice would be to keep active both mentally and physically when possible. This will help slowing down both motor and cognitive decline. And this does not mean running a marathon or solving advanced physics equations. This is a bit of a joke, but it's important. What I mean by this is that the exercise, whether physical or cognitive, can be very mild, very simple, and adapted to your situation. So if you're able to do so, walking will help. Slow dancing, such as tango or whatever you may like, as long as it doesn't have deep impact, can help. Or little yoga and tai chi exercise, and even receiving active massages can help. On the cognitive side, simple things like reading, playing games, listening to music have all been shown to help somehow. I think what's important is more to keep regular at these tasks or exercise is much more important than the intensity at which you do it. So you should adapt the intensity to your current abilities. So I would like to finish and thank you all for your attention. I would like to thank my collaborators, which you can see on the screen, that I will not all name, and the different sources of funding that have helped my studies, and thank again the Parkinson's Society Canada. So I will now try to answer some questions that we've received through email. So one question was whether omega-3 supplementation have any benefit on cognitive function. We have colleagues who are looking into this in nutrition, It does seem to help somehow, but I do not have a definite answer. I've been asked if age is the best predictor of dementia. If a person develops Parkinson's early in the disease and shows some signs of mild cognitive impairment, might they possibly develop dementia at an earlier stage? It's always a possibility. It is not necessarily that they will develop it much earlier. It will depend on the type of mild cognitive impairments that are observed at the beginning of the disease. It's a possibility, but it's not necessarily the case. Oh, I received an interesting question to which I don't have an answer, but I think it's worth mentioning. Is there any known connection between cognitive impairment and impairment of the autonomous nervous system? Effects such as loss of fine control of body temperature. So I do not personally study this myself, and I've got to say that this has been a bit overlooked by many researchers, but it is now starting to be studied more and more, and it's an interesting avenue to explore.
So, Dr. Monchi, I just wondered, can you explain Parkinson's and Alzheimer's can coexist, and maybe you could
this is
the challenges of that.
Well, this is what we're trying to find out. There's a debate among clinicians, researchers, as whether dementia in Parkinson's disease is completely linked to Parkinson's patients, or whether they could be, in some patients, Alzheimer's disease could also develop, especially in the oldest patients. It's still on the debate. My personal feeling is that actually both can occur. In that, in some patients, there could be a development of a Parkinson's disease dementia that could be more specific to Parkinson's disease and will differ from Alzheimer's disease. Whereas in some cases, possibly, especially for the older patients, some Alzheimer's disease may be co-occurring. Yes. Some pathology studies have shown that in some brains we do see some Alzheimer's disease type pathology, but not all of them.
Great. Another question around the other dementias. How do we distinguish between Lewy body dementia and Parkinson's?
That's a very good question. Well, once again, the easiest distinction has to do with timing. Indeed, unfortunately, for people with Lewy body dementia, within a year or two, we will observe both the similar symptoms on the motor side as those observed in Parkinson's disease, as well as advanced cognitive deficits, which already meet the criteria of dementia within 2 years.
We have another question. A correlation between apathy and fatigue. Physical fatigue is almost always driven by the mental fatigue. So any comments in terms of that correlation?
It's a good question, and it's in part why it's hard to always distinguish between the two. I think what we're trying to find out is whether it's mostly due to the motor fatigue, or there's more apathy goes beyond just fatigue. It's also a bit of lack of motivation to do some kind of task.
You spoke earlier, Dr. Monchi, about the behaviors and the addictive behaviors. Are there any tools that can really assess a person's risk of having that behavior before they choose a medication?
I'm not necessarily the biggest expert on this, but I'm not sure if there are many tools. They're being developed now and have been discussed at various meetings on Parkinson's disease. So there are some questionnaires that will help. Of course, if there's some distinguishing features that you know about the patient, or that the patient knows himself, or sometimes the spouse or the child, it's nice to mention them to the clinician. One of the problems, it's often the things that you will not be motivated to mention, either because you can be embarrassed to talk about them, or either because you think they might be secondary to the disease. Mm-hmm. And as much as possible, it'd be nice if you think that even in the past, before the occurrence of Parkinson's disease, you've noted some type of addictive behavior or something a bit different, just to mention it to the clinician, as it will help. It will help possibly identifying some tendency. On the other hand, one should not try to too much over-analyze what has been going on prior to the disease.
Okay, great. Okay, so we still have some questions coming in. I don't know if we'll have enough time in terms of answering them all here, but we will endeavor to answer the questions offline. So do continue to submit them, and we will make sure we get back to you on them. The webinar is going to be hosted on our website along with the video and the PowerPoint presentation. So please visit www.parkinson.ca in the next few days, and you'll be able to view the webinar again. We have one question from Tunisia here. Just give us a moment in French, and Dr. Mongi will answer that one.
I received a question in French regarding retrieving and encoding information. The question mentioned that retrieving information that has already been read, it's mentioned that in order to retrieve information, it can only be, one also has to find out whether it has been encoded, which was mentioned that une information lue ne peut pas nécessairement dire qu'elle est emmagasinée. So the person is asking, how can one use this fact to diagnose Parkinson's disease? Comment alors peut-on se baser sur un tel fait pour diagnostiquer la maladie de Parkinson? So I'll first answer in French. Ce que j'ai montré aujourd'hui, en aucun cas n'est pas là pour être utilisé pour diagnostiquer la maladie. Je parlais de différence en général entre les patients atteints de déficit cognitif dans la maladie de Parkinson et ceux qui ont d'autres types de cognitifs déficits, par exemple dans la maladie d'Alzheimer ou d'autres problèmes cognitifs. Et donc je mentionnais juste des problèmes de mémoire qui sont plus liés justement à la récupération et pas à l'emmagasinage, mais c'est pas sur cette base qu'on va reconnaître un patient atteint de la maladie de Parkinson. So what I said is that I was not mentioning anything today which can be used to diagnose a patient with Parkinson's disease. What I was mentioning is that in general, Parkinson's patients have more problems with retrieving the information and not storing it or encoding it.
We still have a few more questions. The mild cognitive impairment, Dr. Mongi, does it always progress to dementia?
Not necessarily. Not necessarily, and I should first say that no, it doesn't, and secondly, we still don't know exactly. Once again, there may be patterns that are more suggestive of evolution, like the one I mentioned earlier on, in that when you have cognitive impairment in just one or two domains, It may not necessarily be predictive of evolution, whereas you are affected in multiple domains even though you're not demented, it's more worrying. Okay. We're also looking for actually anatomical markers to combine with these to find out those who are more likely to evolve and those who don't.
Okay, great. Does diet have any effect on cognitive problems that we see in Parkinson? Low blood sugar or anything like
that? Well, it definitely can help. I am not an expert on this, but we're finding out more and more that diet will first have effect on just blood circulation and vascular issues in the brain. So a good diet always helps. But indeed, there are some groups looking into specific diets that may be linked specifically to Parkinson's pathology, as it has even been now suggested that there may be things going on outside the brain in Parkinson's disease, including the digestive system.
Great. You mentioned the transcranial magnetic stimulation, and this caller would like to know a little more about it.
So transcranial magnetic stimulation is a method, it's a device that induces a magnetic current which is transformed into an electrical current and which is supposed to stimulate at high frequencies but very rapidly some regions of the brain and may have effects on also distal regions. We don't yet know exactly how things work, but it has been shown to help in some conditions, especially in depression, but studies are also being done on Parkinson's disease for both motor and cognitive deficits, and we do find some improvement. However, we're not sure how long they last, unlike deep brain stimulation, which has a much longer effect.
Actually, on that question, deep brain stimulation, do you have any comments about patients who have had the surgery developing psychosis or any other cognitive impairments?
Once again, this has been discussed actually in the last conference I went on Parkinson's disease. And once again, what seems it is particularly important prior to having deep brain stimulation to have, to try and address very specifically the cognitive and behavioral profiles of people who will have deep brain stimulation. Because that tendency that is sometimes induced by medication can be increased by deep brain stimulation. It may also depend on the site where deep brain stimulation occurs. And so for some people, deep brain stimulation will be a miracle. For a few unlucky ones, it may have side effects. But these are greatly diminished if the patient, as far as I know, I'm not a surgeon and it's not my specialty, are chosen very carefully.
Okay, that's great. We have a question regarding a nonverbal client. You did mention that Parkinson's impacts speech, but how would you tell how the disease has progressed in a nonverbal client?
I don't think being verbal is so important in addressing these issues. I mean, you can observe in the pattern. I mean, you would be able to. Well, first, a neuropsychologist, even with nonverbal patient, can address a lot of the cognitive domains that I've been talking about. But for someone living around a nonverbal person, you will see change in patterns of behaviors, in taking decisions, in remembering things, remembering locations. They don't necessarily have to be communicated verbally.
Okay. A final question again, just more clarification regarding at what stage of Parkinson's does dementia usually occur? So there's no early onset of the dementia necessarily in Parkinson, or is there any way of determining a time frame for the progression of dementia once it has been diagnosed?
This is a very good question. There is no single answer to this. it is fairly rare to observe dementia at stage 1 or 2, and even early stage 3, but stage 1 or 2, say. Mm-hmm. But this doesn't mean that it never occurs. No, there is no definite answer to that, and it's basically where our research, why we're doing this research right now, and it's what we're trying to establish. But as a general rule, it's towards the later stages, but this does not mean that it cannot happen earlier on. Okay. Every patient, once again, is different.
If there is a history of dementia or cognitive impairment in a patient's family, does it necessarily mean that they are also going to be having problems with cognition?
This is a good question. There's no direct answer, but it might increase the risk because some genotype are associated with higher risk of dementia, even in the general population, but that can be found in Parkinson's patients as well. So once again, there is no direct rule, but it might increase the risk.
Okay. So we have a few more questions that, as I mentioned earlier, we will endeavor to answer them offline. We're getting to the end of our time, and you can tell the interest in the topic, Dr. Manchy, is very important for people with Parkinson's, the cognitive issues that impact people living with Parkinson's. I want to thank you so much for your informative and very helpful presentation this afternoon.
Thank you for having me.
Okay.